For the beginnings of Christianity, we want to start in the city of Jerusalem. And that's because there's nothing about the location of Jerusalem which explains its importance in the history of the Middle East and the wider world in terms of its political or its military significance. It has meager natural resources. It doesn't even have a very large agricultural hinterland. It's not on a trade route. The only reason it has become so significant to us down to the present day is as a religious center, first for Jews since the time of King David, and then as the origins of Christendom. According to the canonical Gospels, it was in Jerusalem that Jesus the Jew preached, died, and was buried. He operated in a Jewish world with Jewish disciples. But it was also a Roman world. According to our earliest Christian texts, which are the epistles of St. Paul, which actually say very little about the life and teachings of Jesus, it remained central for Paul to talk about the resurrection of Jesus after his crucifixion by the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. How had Judea and Jerusalem come under Roman rule? The Romans should be stuck in Italy, but they expanded over the western Mediterranean by 200 BCE, and from 200 BCE expanded further into the eastern Mediterranean until by 63 BCE the city of Jerusalem was conquered by the great general Pompey. And direct Roman rule over Judea began in 6 CE, in the early years of Jesus, the use of minimal military forces which operated with exceptional and effective brutality. There's much debate about the historicity of the life of Jesus in the canonical Gospels. But one almost certain fact about him is his crucifixion by the Roman state, and that's because it was deeply unhelpful for the Christian mission in the wider Roman world. But it's always there. That Christian mission was initially to places where Jews had settled. Of course, primarily the homeland, Judea, Galilee, but also the locations in the diaspora, the eastern Mediterranean world, and the Babylonian diaspora that went back to the time of the destruction of the first temple. Some of that diaspora had come about through the deportation of Jews to these faraway places, as in Babylonia. But others had come about through overpopulation in the homeland and Jews going to find a better lifestyle somewhere else. And some had come about through the conversion of non-Jews to Judaism, a notion that almost all forms of Judaism are accepted by around about 200 BCE. So a couple of centuries before the beginning of Christianity. In a pagan polytheistic world, Jews shared the assumption of all others that the best way to worship the gods was in a temple with sacrifices and other offerings. But they were unusual in having just the one temple in Jerusalem, and they were unusual in having a written text which told them how to worship and indeed how to live. That, of course, the Hebrew Bible, completed by around about the 2nd century BCE, both in the Hebrew and in its Greek translation, in the Septuagint, which was what was to be inherited in early Christianity. But although that Bible gave a great deal more uniformity within Judaism than in other ancient religions, because they had a text, it didn't stop immense variety in its interpretation. So we have many references, including in the Gospels, to arguments between Pharisees and Sadducees, and the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in the 1940s have shown us that the degree of variety was far greater than even then we knew. In many respects, the teachings of Jesus, as reported in the Gospels, constituted just another variety of Judaism. There are parallels to individual aspects of pretty well everything he's said to have been taught. More distinctive were the teachings of Paul. Paul presented himself very much as a Jew. You can see that from his willingness to undergo the jurisdiction of Jewish courts and to allow himself to be punished by those courts in order to show his inclusion within the community. And he cited biblical texts to bolster his teachings to demonstrate the fulfillment of the Jewish prophecies. But he was an apostle to Gentiles, as he described himself, and he is an apostle to Gentiles as Gentiles, not requiring them to become Jews. And there's reasons for that was the expectation of the last days. Things were going to change dramatically, he thought, in his lifetime. It was imminent. Despite the continuing Jewish aspects of Christian teachings, by the end of late antiquity, most Christians saw their religion as quite distinct from Judaism. Quite when the parting of the ways came about is hard to pin down and depends on precisely what you mean by that parting. The Judaism of the rabbis, which flourished in the first 5 centuries down to CE and down to the present day, was in antiquity inward-looking, trying to define what it was to be a good adult male rabbinic Jew. They weren't concerned with those outside. They saw Jewish Christians as heretics and non-Jewish Christians as pagans. By contrast, Christians in the early century were eager to define their borders, to ward off the danger of heresies which might infiltrate into their new communities. And the relationship to Judaism was a major issue for Christians in excluding heresy. In the mid-2nd century CE, the heretic Marcion taught that Christians should reject the God of the Old Testament, the Creator God, in favor of the Savior God who'd been worshipped by Paul. In the reaction to Marcion, mainstream Christians decided that the best way to respond was to preserve the Old Testament, if needed, in order to have the fulfillment of prophecy, but to read it allegorically. Hence, you didn't actually have to keep literally the Sabbath and circumcision. By the time of Eusebius, the church historian in the early 4th century, the true Israel was the Christian church, Hebrews were the heroes of the biblical past, and Jews were the remnants of the people of Israel who had forfeited their promise by rejecting Christ. The hostile Christian attitudes to Jews were shaped by the deterioration of status of Judaism within the pagan Roman state from 70 CE. In general, the Romans tolerated local customs, however bizarre they might find them, including those of the Jews, so long as they were traditional. And the destruction of the Jerusalem temple by Rome after the Great Revolt of 66 to 70 was highly unusual in terms of Roman provincial policy. The reasons lie primarily in Roman politics, as do the reasons for the refusal of the Roman state to rebuild the temple. But the impact on Judaism and on Jews has been fundamental to the present day. Not least significant for Jews in the Roman world was the tax imposed by Rome as punishment for the revolt. It was imposed on all Jews, including those in the diaspora who'd taken no part in the war. Exactions taken from lapsed Jews led to unpopular unrest in the city of Rome in the 90s CE, and from 96 CE, only those who identified themselves to Rome as Jews were required to pay. It's hard to overemphasize the resulting quandary for Christians who were uncertain how to relate to their local Jewish communities. Jews could escape persecution for refusing to worship pagan gods if they paid this tax. And so, too, could Christians if they were prepared to identify with them, but they had to identify with their local Jewish community. Now, Jewish monolatry, meaning the insistence on worshipping only one God, was quite bizarre in the eyes of Romans. But it was justified by Jewish tradition. When Jews declined to take part in the imperial cult that Amber's been talking about, they were allowed by the Romans instead to make offerings to the Jewish God on behalf of the Roman emperor. But in the eyes of the Romans, Gentile Christians were pagans who had betrayed their ancestral gods. And if they refused to continue the pagan worship of their ancestors, they were to be punished. Persecutions were sporadic in the first 2 centuries, empire-wide in the mid-3rd and early 4th centuries, leading to martyrdoms and stories of martyrdoms, which became the seed of the church. So talking about martyrdom was a way to bring people into Christianity. Claims about the spread of the faith as testimony to its truth can already be found in the 1st century CE. The actual numbers of Christians in the first 3 centuries is actually much harder to gauge. Much more certain is the impressive organization of the church, with established hierarchies, a civic model, and interregional contacts via letters going right across the Mediterranean world and into the Middle East. In the early 4th century, Eusebius was able to write a history of the church as an institution, like as if he was writing the history of a nation, a remarkable innovation in historical writing. Eusebius was writing under the rule of Constantine, the first Christian emperor. Constantine had converted for political reasons. The Christian God helped him to win a civil war. The impact of his conversion on Roman society was the immediate end of persecution of Christians, and imperial resources shifted from pagan temples to Christian communities for building monumental churches, for providing the great new capital city of Constantine in Constantinople, and funds for bishops for charity and other communal needs. Constantine, too, attempted to enforce doctrinal agreement between Christian leaders at the Council of Nicaea exactly 1,700 years ago, in 325 CE, and was eventually buried in the Church of the Holy Apostles in Constantinople. His enthusiasm for Christianity did not lead to universal conversion in the Roman world. The apostate emperor Julian in the mid-4th century attempted to reintroduce paganism. But by the end of the 4th century, the late 380s, the emperor Theodosius imposed a distinctive form of Catholic Christianity, which was to be exceptionally effective. Opposition among the senatorial aristocracy was short-lived, and paganism survives largely after that in the countryside, hence paganism, paganus, meaning those who live in the countryside. Would Jesus have recognized the world of Christendom established by Theodosius and his successors? He'd have recognized the language of the Old Testament in Christian rhetoric. He would not have recognized the Greek concepts such as Platonism, which is preserved within Christendom, a major achievement of Christendom, the mass allegiance to the Christian God, without loss of the great literary and artistic resources of the Roman world. Jews were preserved in the Christian world in a state of subjection, rationalized by Augustine in North Africa at the time of Theodosius as witnesses to the Christian truth that rejection of Christ led to their punishment. Jerusalem, where Jesus had lived and taught, became part of a Christian Holy Land, a theme park with monumental churches like the Holy Sepulchre and, of course, the Church of Nativity in Bethlehem, an idea as much as a place, a focus of dreams for Christians, as for Jews before and Muslims since, down to the present day.
Thank you, Martin Goodman. I mean, what is it, do you think, in particular about this Christian set of ideas that worries the Romans so much for so long?
The pagan Roman state worried above all about the refusal of Christians to worship the ancestral gods. And that's a continual part of the reason for martyrdom for Christians. So it already starts in the letters of Paul that he tells his Gentile flock, you have to stop worshipping the gods you've always worshipped. And this is so strange in a polytheistic world where it is obvious that there are lots of gods around. So really annoying them by not worshipping them is a dangerous thing to do, not just for the individual, but for the wider community.